Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the land of the Gulkula people, and we need to acknowledge their leaders, both past, present and future. I'd also like to thank the Yolngu people, and particularly the Gulkula people and the Yothu Foundation, for the absolute privilege of being able to work for an organisation and work with people that have an amazing vision for education in this region. I guess as part of our story today, we are going to talk about some of the things that we do in terms of where the Dhupuma Foundation Learning Project has come from and where its vision is into the future. I need to just correct something slightly. I'm not actually the Executive Director of the Dhupuma Foundation Learning Project. I'm actually simply a coordinator of a really important educational project of the Yothu Foundation. I'd also like to say sorry on behalf of Murphy Yunupingu. He may come in a moment, but he is actually doing something else that has come up that he needed to attend to. And I'd also like to acknowledge that the CEO of the Yothu Foundation sits up with us today and will contribute to the conversation. And Denise, thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this amazing project. The Dhupuma Foundation Learning Project, I guess, has its roots in a very long and old story which goes back to the Dhupuma College, which was a really successful and amazing place that was a place of Yolngu education, bilingual education, back in the 70s. And I often think when people talk about the lack of success, and we've heard lots about lots of success that are happening now, but we also often hear this deficit thing around success. I think about the Dhupuma College, and I think about the amazing leadership that's come through that amazing project back in the 70s. I think you would find that every leader, every Yolngu leader throughout Arnhem Land, East Arnhem Land, in Arnhem Land in fact, went through the Dhupuma experience. Thought leaders that have changed policy at a national level came through the Dhupuma Foundation, the Dhupuma College. It was an absolute place where Yolngu people learnt and became leaders. And perhaps by the time we finish this story, we might be asking the question about why we don't reinstate a Dhupuma College in this region. Our project has taken its name in its stead, and I guess it works with young people from the ages of 13 to 17, although the project is often a little bit outside of those ages. It's primarily young people that have been, we would say, alienated from the education process. Many people would use language like disengaged and other bits of what I think is a little bit deficit. These young people are certainly not disengaged. It just happens they're not engaged in mainstream education at this point in time. They're extremely engaged in the learning process that we see, and certainly engaged in the community as a whole. The vision for the project is that all Yolngu will have the foundation needed to steer their future, be role models, balance Yolngu and Ngāpuhi worlds, and balance in that worlds. One of the things that we're starting to recognise, and the reason Molly Shorthouse is a part of this discussion this afternoon, is we've realised that the intersection between health and education is a critical one. Many of the young people that we work with need some support in that health basis, and we need to understand in an educational context how indeed we work with these young people across that health and education intersect. And if we don't get that right, then we believe it won't be right. And that's certainly one of the learnings that we've had over the last 18 months, that we haven't perhaps done that as well as we might, and we've acknowledged that, and in a true spirit of partnership, we've started to look at ways in which we can change that. I must acknowledge that over the 18 months, the partnership has been with the Department of Education, They've been an important partner, and they continue to be a partner. And I guess we are looking to continue partnership, but we also think that there are some questions around the way we work together, and not only the way we work together with the Education Department, but more fully with a range of other things, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. The pedagogy that we use is primarily, it's co-created with the community and the young people, and that pedagogy is evolving, and certainly as we do the work that we are doing at the moment in terms of creating a model of case management in partnership with Me Watch Health and working with the Mental Health Commissioner as getting good advice and guidance from that to create a framework that actually is in true partnership and actually recognises that really important intersection of health and education. We believe it needs to be evidence-based, and we need to get much better at evaluating the program so that we can understand how we can do this in a better way, how we can base it in evidence, and I guess get that action reflection cycle happening within the context of the work that we do. The other thing that we absolutely believe, and a statement from Russell Bishop, is that what we've discovered and what we've learnt is that this statement is true, that what works for Indigenous and marginalised people or students actually works for everybody. Doesn't necessarily work the other way around. And often young Indigenous people are being forced to be looking at the other way around. I'd like to ask Denise to come up and just talk about this really complex web. We've coined it, and some people don't like what we've coined it, but I think it's a really important name, and we've called it the educational Medusa. It's this really complex web that often gets in the way and trips us over in this really important health and education process. So Denise.
Thank you, Peter. Definitely a incredibly complex web that probably needs to be unpicked, we think. So our education journey to date has found this particular education Medusa story. And with a bit of explanation, I hope that you can see some of the congestion points that will need to be given some real attention. At the top of the page, you'll see there are, in blue, quite a large number of both federal and Northern Territory government departments. And when you think about a coalition federal government with a Labor Party Northern Territory government, there's one of the points of that needs some bipartisan support from both sides of government, depending on, regardless who's in government. You'll see there is an overlap between a federal system that puts a focus on education, such as school attendance, safe communities and whatnot. But there's also a similar situation that the Northern Territory government also puts a focus on, and so we see a little bit of a sort of plates here, and we need to bring this same onto the same level. Now that's really difficult sometimes because we're all obviously, guided by election cycles, and oftentimes, winning government is the order of the day, and the kids tend to get forgotten in a situation where it's about politics. So the political football is also another congestion point that also needs bipartisanship, and that's also very difficult, obviously. So we also have a system here in the Northern Territory which is very much Darwin oriented. Parliament House is in Darwin, and the policy down approach often is very difficult on the ground. That filtering down process is very difficult, and also up the scale too. Now, we've been very fortunate enough to work with the Northern Territory Department of Education, and it's been a learning curve for us all, I think everybody would admit. But it isn't for want of trying that we've tried to get to this point and try to, clear the pathway, I guess, to get rid of all of those congestion points. But further, you'll see in the middle layer, the Northeast Arnhem Land has obviously got a very healthy amount of Yolngu educators. So there seems to be quite a interest in this region, and in the white sections you'll see we've found quite a lot of education programs in this region. And that's great. It's healthy, it's fantastic, but oftentimes there's too much going on. So when you have too much going on, people tend to get pushed and pulled in certain directions, and it's that clarity that we need. It needs a real streamline approach, and it needs some oversight to make sure that we're not clashing or rubbing against anyone else's grain or anyone else's program. It's an enhancement component that we need, and we obviously want to add more value to quality as opposed to getting bogged down in clashing. The third component down the bottom is at a local level. Now, at a local level, we have organisations again that are vying for funding and all sorts of programs. So if it's not clearly conceptualised and a unified approach, then people tend to get rather frustrated because they don't know what's going on any given day sometimes. Now, that's not to say there aren't some fantastic things happening here in Northeast Arnhem Land. It really just does need some digging down and some real review and some making sure that it doesn't get further complicated along the way. So that's our Education Medusa story. I hope it gives you a bit of insight into what we're dealing with here in our Dhupuma Foundational Learning. Thank you.
So just to expand on that from an on-the-ground perspective, there's just two vignettes that I want to share with you. So, and these are not isolated cases. So one day last year, the educator and myself were going to pick up the young people down in Guniara, at a house in Guniara. And there were a number of students that we knew were there that needed to come to the project. And principally, we got there at the, ready for the time that they needed to go to school. And literally 6 different organisations were in a line before us waiting to see these young people. They included, Anglicare as their caseworkers, Territory Families, Department of Health, Volatile Substance Abuse Workers, Me Watch Health, the Department of Families Justice and Outreach. So there's no case management, there's no communication, there's little coordination amongst these groups, and all happening at a time where the young person is supposed to be going into an educational context. Another example, we were again going to pick up some young people in another house in Guniara, and again we started, this time we couldn't find the young people, and we started asking around the community where these young people were, and no one seemed to know. But later that day we discovered that Family Territories had come and actually taken the young people down to Alice Springs to a project called Bush Mob for 8 weeks because they'd been involved in some volatile substance abuse here. And again, there was no communication, no case management, and this sort of cycle continues to happen. Then on their return, although we'd had a sort of a little meeting together about these young people coming back, there was again no wraparound services, no case management, no communication about how we were going to work with those young people in ensuring that they were going to be looked after. And sure enough, the very night that they returned, they were back into VSA. There are much better ways of working with these young people. And so, again, the Me Watch and ourselves have been working on a way to solve some of these problems. I'm going to ask Molly Shorthouse to come and just talk a little bit about some of the work that underpins what we're thinking about and what we're going to be doing. And then I'll talk about hopefully how it comes together and how we might move forward in a collective impact type model that actually see some real partnerships being formed, and hopefully partnerships with some of the people in the audience today.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for the invitation to speak. I just wanted to give a little bit of a background as to why I'm even speaking at the moment. I've been living in Arnhem Land for 10 years, the very great privilege of becoming very close to many Yolngu people and learning the very sophisticated worldview. And I, prior to that, was doing psychiatry training and psychology training and decided I wanted to be remote, so I kind of combined them all and came up to Arnhem Land. Once I was here, no one else was providing psychiatry or psychology services, and so I very quickly began a clinic and outreach services and home visits, very much just in the mental health sphere. And then I very quickly realised that every single diagnostic system that I'd been taught was wrong. Well, not wrong, but didn't really apply here. And that there was one thing in common, actually, with a lot of the presentations, and it was related to trauma. This slide up here is the very well-known now social and emotional model, wellbeing model of care. This is something that Me Watch Health follows very closely. Next slide. I'll do that one. Yeah. So. No.
How's that?
So about 5 years ago, I started looking into what is this? What is trauma? What does it do to the brain? What can we find out about it? And I found a course that could be delivered, and I rang them up and I said, please, can you come up to Arnhem Land? We really need to learn some more about this. It was, I was told by the Primary Health Network at the time that it wasn't relevant and not worth funding, so I took the $3,000 out of my savings for our family holiday and brought them up instead, just hoping that I'd get 30 people in the room to pay $100 and I'd get the money back and the kids could still go on holiday. And I did. The room was full. And the room was full with teachers, basically. Yeah. There wasn't any nurses, there wasn't any doctors, teachers and parents and foster parents. And the reception from it was phenomenal. All of us sort of sat there and went click, 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 right, now we get it. And we want to start applying this properly. And I know that, especially, for example, at Yolngu School, they're doing an amazing job of trauma-informed care. And so that was the beginnings of my work here and understanding trauma. For those of you who don't know, and probably many do now, but trauma has a profound cognitive effect. So it affects the development of the brain in all children, and things like ADHD can actually be related to trauma and over-arousal. And once you start to understand the cognitive effects of trauma, you look through that lens with everything. And this was the study that really affected all of us in the room that day. I'm sure. Next slide. Yep. Next slide. Yep. The Adverse Childhood Experience Study, ACE study, it came out of the States, and it's probably one of the most important public health studies that has happened in health. And essentially what it found was that any child exposed to an adverse experience, and there's a list of them, from divorce to having a parent with an addiction to witnessing violence to multiple moving a lot all the time, was directly correlated with health outcomes as adults. So they found increased rates of cancer, increased rates of diabetes, cardiovascular, and of course increased rates of mental illness. So as Director of Medical Services of an Aboriginal health organisation where chronic disease is taking the lives of Yolngu way too young. And just to be clear how young, I did an audit last year from our Communicare database, and the average age of death in men last year was 50 and in women was 54. So this is, it's pretty serious and it's not acceptable. And I realised that actually we're spending all this money in chronic disease at the other end, and that it's really hard to find the funding and the focus to spend it in these early years, in the 0 to 10, and to really try to put more emphasis on that. And I realised, well, where are 0 to 10-year-olds and 0 to 12-year-olds? Well, they're at school most of the time. And if they're not at school, that's our goal. And so I started talking, I'll just click through that one. So I started talking with both at Yolngu School and Dhupuma about how MeWatch can help and be more involved and supporting them so that we can work together more closely. If you go to this, and then just quickly, sorry, the next slide. This is a really important bit of neuroscience about trauma, and also I just want to be clear. This is not just an Indigenous issue. Any child with trauma, the same thing happens to, and there's plenty of other kids that have trauma around Australia and the world. But what is really interesting that I think we can all learn from is that if you look in the very end column there, the kind of treatments and the therapy that really help heal the traumatised brain or the child's brain, these are all what already happen in Yolngu culture and Indigenous culture, and music, movement, dance, storytelling, and in fact, there's very much the likelihood that Indigenous people will be able to teach us more about how to heal this than any of us could ever know. So that's just wanted to finish on again why. Next slide, please. One thing I heard quite early on last year when I took this job as DMS was about a sort of a funding issue, really, relating to the kids in Yolngu and other remote schools. So they have probably around 40 students who have special needs and who need extra support, and they get about 42,000 for that. Meanwhile, if you just go into Nhulunbuy where there's an annex, that one child gets 47,000. I just find this really hard to comprehend, and I've since been diverting health funds to education, and that's part of why I wanted to work with Dhupuma and Yolngu School. And I have seen the effects of community-controlled health in community. Before I worked with MeWatch, I was with Top End Health Services, so employed by the government. And since coming across to MeWatch, I'm an absolute convert in community control. I love the fact that the Yolngu are my boss, and it's a very strong feeling, and it changes the way you act and the way you practice. And I would love to see community-controlled education as well. So thank you. Yeah.
Last slide, Chris. So, very quickly to wrap up, and it's quite complex, the work that we're doing together now is to create a plan for young people, which is an integrated plan that has health and education, a flexible learning plan for the young person, a plan around health and wellness for the cohort of young people that we're working with. It's absolutely based in the social determinants of health, and that's going to help drive some of the curriculum needs out of for the young people, using some really good curriculum that the Education Department have produced, but always remembering that the young person is at the centre of this. I'm happy to talk to anybody about the complexities, because we've done some really quite interesting work in terms of how to remind people about appointments, of mental health appointments, et cetera, tied up into this thing in an electronic context. Where to next? I think that we need to remember that ownership and authorship of this program, and any program for Yolngu, needs to be by Yolngu. We need to find appropriate partners that are willing to work with us in a model of collective impact. We all know that together the impact can be greater. It needs to be sustainable. It needs to be thought about in terms of how do we scale this model. We need to grow the capability of community groups and support staff and educators, and that's in a both ways learning sense. And if you want to know more, and if you want to get involved more, tonight at 9 o'clock we're going to have an education roundtable workshop across in the Knowledge Centre, where we can actually start to progress some action around some of these partnerships and give people an opportunity to talk about ways in which we might move forward. I guess I'd like to reiterate what Molly has said. Perhaps it is time for the rebirthing of the Dhupuma College as a truly Yolngu-owned education facility. I think that is a vision we could work towards. I'd now like to throw to a very important guest. The Governor-General, David Hurley, has joined us and been listening intently, I know. And I know that he would like to respond to some of the things that have been said this afternoon. And I think there's a microphone somewhere that's about to come to you. Thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say about what you've been hearing.
Well, thank you. Bigger audience than I thought. This is our first visit to Garma, and I'll speak again on the stage this afternoon when we have the formal opening. There's been a very interesting conversation, and I think typifies many communities around the country, so it's not just here. As I listened though, three words that kept being talked about: collective impact model or system, I think are absolutely critical here. And as I was speaking to the Vice-Chancellor of Melbourne University in a whisper, that there are a number of models that already exist that can create this. So in terms of process, we're not in a foreign space. The Stanford University collective impact model is a well-known international tried and tested means of bringing disparate groups together to achieve singular outputs or outcomes. So there are systems out there that help us get through these systems. What I've heard though is not uncommon. In 4.5 years as Governor of New South Wales, travelling through New South Wales, I've sat around tables and heard exactly the same conversations in Indigenous communities. Often organisations working in the same community who don't even know what the organisation provides. There is a big communication gap that needs to be dealt with. And many players in a congested field. Because why? There's a lot of goodwill. And you're here because of that goodwill. So thank you for the three who spoke today. Really, bringing children back from the brink is something we all want to do. Healing children, healing families and healing communities is what we all want to do. And so I really hope that the group here has the energy and the wisdom to achieve that. Because, for me, we are in a very important time in our national history. We have a generation of young Aboriginal men and women coming through now, leaders, educated, trained, who want to change our country, need to change our country from their perspective, and we need to provide the platform for that to happen. We miss this chance, we miss it for another generation. So let's hope that this work does what it needs to do here, but it's not just an isolated Northern Territory Arnhem Land solution. The other disappointing thing I've seen is there are so many good things happening around our country, particularly New South Wales I've seen, yet it never gets out of that area. So spreading those good ideas, again communicating, poor communication is the heart of most of our problems. Communicating is something we've got to do, and this is part and parcel of that. So if you've got the wits, the wherewithal, the help here, I'm sure they'd love to hear your voices to provide a solution, to provide direction, but talking, communicating and getting the appropriate model that this will work around is a very good start point. Thank you.